He divorced her at 62 and took the house, so she reopened her father's forgotten feed store. What she found inside wasn't just dust and memories. It was a legacy that would force her to choose between a quiet ending and a fight she never knew she was born for. If you've ever had to start over when you thought your life was already written, maybe this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because we all deserve to find out what's in the next chapter. The key didn't work. That was the first thing. Not a dramatic, wrenching failure, just a quiet, metallic refusal. I stood on the porch of the house I had lived in for 38 years, the house where I'd raised 2 children and hosted 100 holidays, and the key Richard's lawyer had assured me would work for the next 24 hours was just a useless piece of brass in my hand. It slid into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. A small, final act of erasure. He'd already changed the locks. Of course he had. The late afternoon sun was warm on my back, mocking the chill that had settled deep in my bones. A permanent resident since the day he'd sat me down at the polished oak dining table and used the word irreconcilable. I didn't rattle the knob. I didn't pound on the door. I just stood there, looking at the fresh paint on the trim. A color I'd picked out last spring, a soft sage green. He'd hated it at first, then claimed he'd come around. I see now he was just letting me have my way on the small things. A gentle placation while the bigger betrayals were being planned. The manicured lawn, the rose bushes I'd babied for decades, the heavy oak door I'd decorated with a wreath for every season. It was all a stage set, and I was no longer in the play. I turned around, walked down the slate path I'd helped lay one blistering summer, and got back into my 10-year-old sedan. I didn't look back. Looking back felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. My new home was the Sleepwell Motel off the interstate, room 114. It smelled of industrial cleaner and stale cigarette smoke, a smell that clung to everything like a shroud. The bedspread was a stiff synthetic thing with a pattern of burnt orange geometry. The air conditioner rattled with the metallic cough of a terminal patient. For 40 years, my life had been defined by texture and scent, the feel of good linen, the smell of baking bread, the specific weight of a well-loved quilt. Now my world was laminate, polyester, and bleach. It was an institution, a place for people in transit, and I had never felt more transient in my life. I was 62 years old, and my entire existence fit into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of photo albums I'd had the foresight to pack before the final papers were signed. I spent 3 days in that room. I didn't cry. The shock was a kind of anesthetic, a thick, gray packing foam that filled all the empty spaces inside me. I ate vending machine crackers and watched game shows with the sound off, the frantic smiling of the contestants, a bizarre pantomime from another universe. On the 4th day, my phone rang. It was Mr. Evans, the young lawyer who had handled my side of the divorce. He had a kind, tired voice, the voice of a man who saw too much of this. "Clara? Just calling to check in. See how you're holding up." I made a sound that was supposed to be fine. It came out like a cracked whisper. "I'm at the Sleepwell," I said, as if that explained everything. There was a pause. "Right. Well, the final asset transfer is complete. He's wired the settlement amount to your account. It's what the judge ordered, Clara." He didn't have to say it was a pittance. We both knew. Richard's business was a complex web of LLCs and partnerships I'd never been encouraged to understand. On paper, he was barely solvent. In reality, he was vacationing in the Caymans with a woman half my age. The house, the savings, the investments, they were all tangled up in his corporate veil. I was left with my car, my personal effects, and a sum of money that wouldn't last 2 years. "There is one more thing," Mr. Evans said, his voice hesitant. "It's the property in Oakhaven, the old feed store, your father's place." I had to think for a moment. Oakhaven. I hadn't been back in 20 years, not since my father's funeral. The store had been shuttered long before that, a dusty relic on a side street in a town that time was slowly forgetting. My father had left it to me in his will. Richard had always called it the tax burden, A worthless, crumbling building we should have sold for pennies decades ago. We just kept paying the minuscule property taxes on it out of inertia. It wasn't included in the marital assets, Mr. Evans continued. Because it was a direct inheritance, he couldn't touch it. Legally, it's all yours, free and clear. I know it's probably not much, Clara, but it's something. It's a piece of ground that belongs to you. A piece of ground. The words echoed in the sterile silence of the motel room. For 38 years, I had thought I had ground under my feet, a foundation of marriage and family. But it had all been a mirage. The only thing that was truly mine was a derelict building in a town I'd run away from the moment I could. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. I thanked Mr. Evans, my voice still hollow, and hung up the phone. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed and looked at my reflection in the dark television screen. A woman with graying hair, tired eyes, and a future that was a perfect, terrifying blank. A piece of ground. It wasn't a plan, it wasn't a solution, but it was a direction. The next morning I checked out of the Sleepwell Motel, filled my car with gas, and drove east, toward the only home I had left. The drive to Oakhaven was a journey backward in time. The 4-lane interstate gave way to a 2-lane state highway, flanked by sprawling subdivisions that thinned out into rolling farmland. The manicured green of the suburbs bled into the wilder, more honest greens and golds of the countryside. I passed rusted tractors sitting like sleeping iron beasts in fallow fields, and white farmhouses with peeling paint and wide, welcoming porches. With every mile, the air coming through my open window seemed to change, losing the city's exhaust-tinged humidity and taking on the rich, loamy scent of turned earth and distant rain. My mind, which had been a static hum of shock for days, slowly began to stir. Memories I hadn't accessed in years started to surface, triggered by the sight of a specific breed of dairy cow or the shape of a barn's gambrel roof. I remembered sitting in the passenger seat of my father's old Ford pickup, my small feet barely reaching the floor as he drove these same roads. He was a quiet man, my father, with hands that were calloused and kind. He smelled of grain dust, pipe tobacco, and honest work. He'd run Miller's Feed and Seed for 40 years, taking it over from his own father. It was more than a business to him. It was the town's silent, steady heart. He knew every farmer, every family, every struggle. When I left for college, I was eager to escape the smallness of it all. I wanted art galleries and restaurants that served food I couldn't pronounce. I met Richard in my senior year, a business major with a quick smile and a future that seemed as bright and polished as his shoes. He represented everything Oakhaven was not: ambition, sophistication, a life lived on a grander scale. We married, moved to the city, and I slipped into my new role as a corporate wife, a mother, a hostess. I visited Oakhaven less and less. My father never guilted me. "You've built a good life, Clara," he'd say, his eyes proud, but with a flicker of something else I couldn't name then. Sadness? Resignation? I told myself it was pride. It was easier that way. Now I was driving back, not for a holiday visit, but in retreat, a refugee from that good life I had built. The shame was a physical weight in my chest. What would he think of me now, returning at 62, with nothing but a used car and a broken heart? The thought was so painful I had to pull over onto the gravel shoulder of the road. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, the plastic cool against my skin, and for the first time since it all began, I cried. Not silent, dignified tears, but great, ragged sobs that tore through me, a storm of grief for my lost life, my lost love, my lost self. I cried for the young girl who couldn't wait to leave, and for the old woman who had nowhere else to go. After the storm passed, there was a strange quiet. The engine ticked as it cooled. A crow called from a distant fence post. I took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and put the car back in drive. The self-pity was gone, burned away by the tears. In its place was something hard and small and dense. Not hope, not yet, but resolve. I didn't know what I was driving toward, but I knew I had to see it through. Oakhaven appeared around a final bend, nestled in a valley as if cupped in a gentle hand. It hadn't changed much, which was both a comfort and a sorrow. The town square was still there, the courthouse still standing proud, though its stone was darker with age. Some storefronts were boarded up, casualties of a changing world, but others were stubbornly hanging on. I drove past the diner where I'd had my first date, the movie theater that now showed second-run films on weekends only. I turned onto Sycamore Street, and there it was, Miller's Feed and Seed. It was worse than I'd imagined. The sign, once a cheerful hand-painted red and white, was now a ghost of itself. The letters flaked away to reveal the gray, weathered wood beneath. The large plate glass windows were opaque with years of grime, and a thicket of weeds grew up from the cracks in the sidewalk, clutching at the foundation. The green paint on the facade was peeling in long, curling strips, like sunburnt skin. It looked abandoned, forgotten, a tombstone for a dead business. My heart sank. Mr. Evans had said it was a piece of ground. Looking at it now, it felt more like a grave. I parked the car across the street and just stared at it, the little knot of resolve in my chest tightening into a cold fist of dread. What on earth had I done? For a full 10 minutes, I just sat in the car, the engine off, a silent observer of my own inheritance. A few cars rumbled past. An elderly woman walking a small dog gave my out-of-county plates a curious glance. This was a town where a new car was a topic of conversation for a week. A prodigal daughter returning after 2 decades would be front-page news, if the Oakhaven Gazette hadn't folded 10 years ago. Finally, I couldn't put it off any longer. I took the old, heavy iron key from my purse, a key I hadn't touched in years, found in a dusty box of my father's things, and crossed the street. The air was still and warm, carrying the scent of cut grass from a nearby lawn. The lock on the front door was stiff with rust and disuse. I had to put my whole body into it, gritting my teeth, my shoulder pressed against the door. For a moment, I thought it was another failed key, another locked door. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, the deadbolt gave way. The door swung inward on creaking hinges, opening into darkness. The smell hit me first. It was a complex symphony of decay and memory. The sharp, musty scent of damp and dust was layered over a fainter, ghostly aroma of old grain, sweet molasses, and dry earth. It was the smell of my childhood. I stepped inside, and my eyes took a moment to adjust to the gloom. Sunlight struggled through the filthy windows, cutting dusty, golden shafts through the air. The interior was vast, much larger than I remembered. Pallets were stacked high with petrified bags of something. Fertilizer maybe, or seed, their paper sides brittle and stained. A thick blanket of gray dust covered everything, the long wooden counter, the antique cash register, the shelves lined with rusted cans and faded boxes. Cobwebs, thick as cotton candy, draped from the rafters. It was a place frozen in time. A calendar from 1992 hung crookedly on the wall. A picture of a golden retriever sitting in a field of wildflowers. It felt like my father had just walked out the door one day and never come back. I ran a hand along the surface of the main counter, the wood worn smooth and dark with the grease and sweat of 1,000 hands, my father's chief among them. I could see him standing there, a pencil tucked behind his ear, patiently explaining the merits of one type of chicken feed over another to a customer. He was a man of infinite patience, a quality I had not inherited. I made my way through the cavernous main room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. In the back, past the main storage area, was his office. The door was closed. I tried the knob. Locked. My heart, which had been a steady, heavy drum, gave a little flutter of, what? Not fear. Anticipation. My father was a methodical man. He had a place for everything. I walked back to the front counter and felt underneath, my fingers searching for the magnetic key box he'd always kept there for emergencies. My hand closed around cold metal. It was still there. Inside was a small brass key. I went back to the office, the key feeling warm in my palm. It slid into the lock with a well-oiled ease that surprised me. The door opened into a small, paneled room. It was just as dusty as the rest of the store, but more personal. A worn leather armchair sat behind a large oak desk. Framed photos on the wall were hazy under a film of dust. One was of my mother, who died when I was 12. Another was of me, age 16, awkward in my prom dress. On the desk, a tarnished silver pipe stand held his favorite briar pipe. It was all exactly as he'd left it. I felt like an intruder, a ghost visiting another ghost's domain. My eyes were drawn to a large black metal strongbox tucked under the desk. It wasn't locked. I lifted the heavy lid, a metallic squeak echoing in the quiet room. Inside was not money or deeds or anything of obvious value. It was filled with old leather-bound ledgers and, right on top, a thick manila envelope. In my father's familiar blocky handwriting were 2 words: "For Clara." My breath caught in my throat. I sat down in his creaking armchair, the leather sighing under my weight, and I carefully, with trembling fingers, opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written on his business stationery. The date at the top was from a month before he died. "My dearest Clara," it began, "if you are reading this, it means 2 things. First, that I am gone, and second, that you have come home. I pray that you have come home for a happy reason, a visit to feel close to your old dad. But I am a practical man, and I suspect that is not the case. I suspect you are reading this because life has thrown you a curve you did not see coming, and you have found yourself in need of a place to land. I want you to know that is why I kept this place. That is what it is for." I had to stop reading. The words were a direct hit, a voice from the grave that saw my present situation with a clarity that stunned me. I looked around the dusty office, at the ghost of the man who had sat in this very chair and penned these words, thinking of me, thinking of a future he wouldn't see. A wave of grief, so sharp and sudden it felt like a physical blow, washed over me. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to hold back the tears. He had known. Somehow he had known that the shiny, perfect life I had built was more fragile than I believed. After a moment, I continued reading. "I know you never understood why I didn't sell the store. Richard, I'm sure, called it a sentimental waste. He is a man who understands balance sheets, but not foundations. This store, Clara, is a foundation. It is not much to look at, I know. It is old and tired, much like its owner. But it is built on solid ground, and it belongs to you in a way nothing else ever will. No man, no bank, no court can take it from you. It was my gift to my father, and his to me, and now mine to you. It is a place to be your own woman." He went on to explain the practical things, the location of the deed, the bank account with a small amount of money he'd left in it for taxes, the name of a lawyer in town, a young man named Robert Evans, whose father he'd helped out of a jam years ago. My Mr. Evans. The connections, the threads of care my father had woven into the fabric of this town, were slowly revealing themselves to me. The last paragraph was what broke me. "I know I wasn't a man of many words, Clara. I found it easier to measure out grain than to measure out my heart. But I saw you. I saw your strength, even when you didn't. I saw your good, kind heart. Whatever has happened, whatever brought you back to this dusty old place, do not think of it as a failure. Think of it as a chance to plant something new. This place has good soil. You just have to be willing to do the work. All my love, Dad." I put the letter down on the desk and finally let the tears come. I cried for the father I had never fully understood, a man whose quiet love was so much deeper and more prescient than I had ever realized. I cried for his loneliness after my mother died, a loneliness he never spoke of. I cried for the years I had wasted, keeping him at arm's length, because I was so busy building a life that had turned out to be made of sand. And I cried because, for the first time in a long, long time, I did not feel entirely alone. His love was right here, a tangible presence in this dusty room, a final gift left for me to find when I needed it most. He had left me more than a building. He had left me a purpose. The question, the terrifying, overwhelming question that settled in my heart as the tears subsided, was whether I had the strength to live up to it. I sat there in the deepening twilight, the letter clutched in my hand, feeling the full weight of my father's legacy settle onto my shoulders. It was one thing to read his words of encouragement. It would be another thing entirely to act on them. The scale of the task was monumental. I was 62. My work experience consisted of volunteering for school fundraisers and managing a household. I knew how to organize a dinner party, not a stock order. The store wasn't just dusty, it was derelict. It would take a small fortune just to make it habitable, a fortune I did not have. The settlement from Richard was a ticking clock, each dollar spent bringing me closer to zero. Doubt, cold and insidious, began to creep in. My father had seen strength in me, but all I could feel was exhaustion. He saw a foundation, but I saw a ruin. Richard's voice echoed in my head, his calm, condescending tone as he'd explained why our marriage was over. "Let's be realistic, Clara. You're not equipped for the modern world. I've been taking care of you for 40 years. For 40 years I had let him. I had allowed my world to shrink to the size of our home, our social circle. He had managed the money, made the decisions. I had managed the surfaces, making sure everything looked perfect. And now, here I was, unequipped. I looked around the office, at the peeling varnish on the desk, the water stain in the corner of the ceiling. It was too much. The weight of his faith in me felt less like a gift and more like a crushing burden. Maybe the smart thing to do, the realistic thing, was to sell. Take whatever I could get for the property, add it to my meager nest egg, and find a small, sad apartment somewhere to live out the rest of my days. It was a bleak picture, but it felt safe, manageable. This dream of his, this resurrection of a dead business, felt like a fantasy, a sentimental trap. I was spiraling, caught in a whirlpool of grief and fear, when I heard a faint noise from the front of the store, a soft metallic clink. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sun had set, and the store was now cloaked in near total darkness. I wasn't thinking about ghosts. I was thinking about vagrants, or teenagers looking for a place to cause trouble. I stood up slowly, my chair groaning in protest, and peered through the office doorway into the blackness of the main room. I could see nothing. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, the sound of something being slid across the floor. My hand fumbled for the light switch just inside the office door. I flicked it. Nothing. Of course. The electricity had been shut off for years. My mind raced. My phone was in the car. The only thing on the desk that could be a weapon was a heavy stapler. I picked it up, its cold weight feeling both absurd and reassuring in my hand. I crept out of the office, my shoes scuffing softly on the gritty floor. As I neared the front of the store, I could see a sliver of light under the main door. Someone was out there. The sound came again, and I realized what it was. Someone was sliding something under the door. An envelope. I waited until I heard footsteps retreating down the sidewalk. Then, with the stapler still held like a club, I moved to the door. A crisp, white business envelope lay on the floor. My name wasn't on it. It was addressed to current property owner. I picked it up. It was heavy, made of expensive paper. I used my car key to slit it open, my hands shaking slightly. Inside was a letter, printed on glossy letterhead. The logo at the top read, Oak Valley Development Group. "Dear property owner," it said, "Oak Valley Development Group is engaged in a revitalization project for the downtown Oak Haven area. Your property at 14 Sycamore Street has been identified as a key parcel for our planned multi-use commercial and residential complex. We understand that the property in its current state is likely more of a liability than an asset to you. As such, we are prepared to make a generous, all-cash offer of $50,000 for the immediate purchase of the lot, as is. This offer is contingent on a swift, uncomplicated closing process within the next 30 days. We believe this represents a significant opportunity for you to divest yourself of a non-performing asset and contribute to the future of Oak Haven." $50,000. The number hung in the air, shimmering. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than I had expected. It was a lifeline. It was the safe option. It was the answer to the suffocating panic that had been building in my chest. I could take that money, add it to my settlement, and I wouldn't be destitute. I could find that small, sad apartment and be secure. All I had to do was sign a piece of paper. Give up. Let them tear this place down and turn it into something new and shiny, something that had nothing to do with me or my father. I read the letter again. A liability, non-performing asset. The language was so cold, so transactional. It dismissed my father's life's work, his legacy, his final gift to me, as a piece of financial debris. It was the same language Richard had used. It was the language of men who saw the world in terms of profit and loss, who could bulldoze a lifetime of memories without a second thought, because it made good business sense. And a sudden, hot wave of anger surged through me, so powerful it took my breath away. It was an anger I hadn't felt in years. I had been placid Clara, agreeable Clara, the wife who smoothed things over and never made a fuss. I hadn't even been angry at Richard, just hurt and bewildered. But this letter, this condescending, dismissive offer, lit a fuse I didn't know I had. They were not just trying to buy a piece of land. They were trying to erase my father. They were trying to erase me. I walked back to the office, the letter crumpled in my fist. I sat down at the desk, my father's letter lying next to the developer's offer. Balance sheets versus foundations. The choice was suddenly, starkly clear. It wasn't about whether I could succeed. It wasn't about being realistic. It was about whose story I was going to let be told. Theirs, a story of demolition and profit, or his, a story of legacy, of community, of a place to be my own woman. I picked up my phone, which I'd retrieved from the car, and dialed Mr. Evans. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm with concern. "Clara, is everything all right?" "I'm at the store," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was steady. It was a voice I hadn't heard myself use in a very long time. "I just received an offer on the property from the Oak Valley Development Group." "Ah," he said, a note of weariness in his tone. "They've been buying up a lot of downtown. What are they offering?" $50,000. He was silent for a moment. "Clara, that's a lowball offer. But frankly, it might be the best you'll get. The building needs a lot of work." "I'm not selling," I said. There was another pause, this one filled with surprise. "You're not?" "No," I said, and the word felt solid, real. It felt like the first brick in a new foundation. "Tell them thank you, but the property is not for sale. Miller's Feed and Seed is reopening for business." For the first time that day, a genuine smile touched my lips. I had no idea how I was going to do it, but I had made a choice. I was going to do the work. The soil was good. It was time to plant something new. After I hung up with Mr. Evans, a sense of calm settled over me. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the presence of purpose. For the first time in my adult life, I was entirely on my own, and it was terrifying. But it was also, strangely, liberating. There was no one to consult, no one to please, no one to manage my expectations. The decision was mine alone. My first act as the new proprietor of Miller's Feed and Seed was to find a place to sleep. The thought of returning to the anonymous misery of the Sleepwell Motel was unbearable. I drove to the Oak Haven Inn, a slightly worn but clean establishment on the town square. The woman at the desk, a lady with a magnificent beehive of white hair, looked at me over her spectacles. "You're not from around here," she stated, not unkindly. "I used to be," I said. "I'm Clara Miller. My father was Frank Miller." Her face broke into a wide, genuine smile. "Frank's girl! Lord have mercy! I haven't seen you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper." "I'm Doris. Your father was a good man. A very good man." That was how it started, the slow, steady weaving of my life back into the fabric of this town. The next morning I began the work. I started with the windows. It took a bucket of hot water, a bottle of vinegar, and an entire roll of paper towels for each one. But as the layers of grime dissolved, light poured into the store for the first time in decades. It was a revelation. The light didn't just illuminate the dust. It changed the very feel of the space, chasing the gloomy, tomb-like atmosphere into the corners. It began to feel less like an ending and more like a beginning. The physical labor was grueling. My body, accustomed to light gardening and yoga, screamed in protest. Every muscle ached. My hands were raw and blistered by the end of the first day. But there was a deep, cleansing satisfaction in it. I was sweeping away not just dust, but the inertia of my past life. With every bag of trash I hauled to the curb, I felt lighter. I was transforming the space, and in doing so, I was transforming myself. On the third day, as I was wrestling a stack of petrified feed bags toward the door, an old pickup truck pulled up. An elderly man in overalls and a faded John Deere cap got out. He was stooped with age, but his eyes were bright and sharp. "You Frank Miller's girl?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I am," I said, wiping a dusty hand on my jeans. "Thought so. You got his eyes. Name's Henry Gable. Your dad. He saved my farm back in '88. Drought was bad. Bank was calling in my loan. I came in here, told him I couldn't make my payment. He looked me in the eye, told me to take what feed I needed and pay him back when the rains came. They came. I paid him. Bank never found out. He never said a word about it to anyone." He looked at the newly clean windows, the growing pile of debris on the sidewalk. "Heard you were reopening. If you need a hand, you let me know." He didn't wait for an answer. He just nodded, got back in his truck, and drove away. I stood there, stunned. It was then that I decided to look at the other things in the strongbox, the ledgers. That evening, back in my room at the inn, I opened the first one. It was a standard accounting ledger, but the entries were strange. Next to names and dates and amounts, my father had made notes in a kind of code. Gable, June '88, wait for rain. Widow Jensen, December '90, kids need coats. Sawyer boy, August '87, broke his arm, can't work. And next to so many of them, in faded red ink, were the words, paid in full. But there were no corresponding payment entries. He hadn't been forgiving their debts. He had been paying them himself. He was marking them as settled in his books, so that if anything happened to him, no one could come after these people for what they owed. I went through ledger after ledger, spanning 30 years. It was a secret history of the town, a story of quiet, profound generosity. My father hadn't just been a shopkeeper. He had been the town's safety net. He had functioned as an unofficial bank, a one-man charity, shouldering the burdens of his neighbors without fanfare or recognition. The small amount of money in the store's bank account suddenly made sense. He hadn't been a poor businessman. He had been investing his profits directly back into his community, into the lives of the people around him. Richard had always called my father a man with no ambition. He was wrong. My father's ambition was just of a different kind. It wasn't about accumulation, but about contribution. It wasn't about building an empire, but about sustaining a community. I felt a surge of fierce, protective pride. The developer's offer wasn't just an insult to a building. It was an assault on this entire legacy of unseen kindness. News travels fast in a small town. The story of Frank's girl cleaning out the old feed store became the topic of conversation at the diner, the post office, the hardware store. People started stopping by. Some, like Henry Gable, came to share a memory of my father. Others, younger people who had never known him, were just curious. A young woman with bright pink hair and dirt under her fingernails introduced herself as Sarah. She ran a small organic farm just outside of town. "This is so cool," she said, her eyes wide as she looked around the cavernous space. "This town needs something like this. A real place, you know, not another dollar store." She offered to help me set up a social media page. I didn't even know what that really meant, but I gratefully accepted. A retired carpenter named George offered to look at the building's structural integrity for free. Doris from the inn started bringing me a hot lunch every day. Slowly, tentatively, a network of support began to form around me. These people weren't just helping me clean a store. They were helping me rebuild a life. They were showing me what my father had understood all along. A foundation isn't made of concrete, it's made of people. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. A sleek, black SUV started parking across the street for an hour or so every day. A man in a suit would sit inside, talking on his phone, just watching. It was unnerving. Then, a second letter from Oak Valley Development arrived, this time by certified mail. The tone was no longer friendly. It mentioned zoning regulations, blight ordinances, and the significant costs of bringing a derelict property up to code. They doubled their offer to $100,000, but it was couched in language that felt more like a threat than a negotiation. This is our final offer before we pursue other avenues to acquire the property for the betterment of the community. I read the letter standing behind the old wooden counter, the first rays of morning sun streaming through the clean windows. The fear was there, a cold knot in my stomach. They had money, lawyers, and influence. I had a dwindling bank account and a half-restored store. But I also had my father's ledgers and the stories of the people who kept stopping by. I had Henry Gable and Sarah and George and Doris. I looked at my hands. They were no longer the soft, manicured hands of a suburban housewife. They were scratched, calloused, and strong. I had done this. I had brought this place back from the dead. I wasn't just Frank Miller's girl anymore. I was the owner of Miller's Feed and Seed. And I was not going to be intimidated. I tore the letter in half and threw it in the trash. The fight was just beginning. The reflection that settled in my soul during those long weeks of work was profound. It was a quiet recalibration of everything I thought I knew about value, about wealth, about home. For nearly 40 years, I had lived in a house that was a showpiece. Every piece of furniture was carefully chosen, every surface polished, every room designed to project an image of success and stability. Richard and I had accumulated things: art, cars, expensive appliances. We had a portfolio, we had assets. But what I came to understand in the dusty, echoing space of my father's store was that we had never truly built a home. A house is a structure, an assemblage of wood and nails and glass. A home is a place of belonging, of unconditional acceptance, of shared history. My house had been built on the precarious ground of Richard's ambition and my compliance. When the foundation of our marriage cracked, the entire structure came crashing down, leaving me with nothing. The feed store was the opposite. On the surface, it was a wreck. The roof sagged, the floors creaked, the paint was a distant memory. By any conventional measure, it was worthless, a non-performing asset. But its foundation was sunk deep into the bedrock of community, cemented with decades of my father's quiet integrity. The wealth of this place wasn't in a bank account. It was in the memories of the people it had served. It was in Henry Gable's gratitude, in Doris's kindness, in the hopeful energy of young farmers like Sarah. My father hadn't left me a piece of real estate. He had left me a share in a community's heart. He had left me a place where I belonged, not because of who I was married to, but because of who my father was, and, increasingly, because of who I was becoming. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes after you lose everything you thought you were supposed to want. The fear of failure, the pressure to keep up appearances, it all just evaporates. When you're starting from zero, every small victory is a miracle. Getting the water turned back on, finding a wholesaler who would extend me a small line of credit based on my father's name alone. The day Sarah helped me create a simple website and a Facebook page, and we got our first like from someone who wasn't a personal acquaintance. These were my new treasures, more precious than any piece of jewelry Richard had ever given me. The work was slow, but it was steady. George the carpenter, true to his word, spent a week reinforcing some of the main support beams, refusing any payment other than coffee and a promise of a discount when we opened. Sarah convinced me to stock a small section of organic, locally sourced seeds and gardening supplies, things my father never would have dreamed of. We decided not to just be a feed store, but a hub for the new generation of small farmers and homesteaders in the area. We would bridge the old Oak Haven with the new. The man in the black SUV was a constant, silent presence. I learned from Doris that he was a representative from the development group, a man named Henderson. He was waiting for me to fail, He was waiting for me to run out of money, or energy, or hope. His presence was a daily reminder of the stakes. One afternoon, he got out of his car and approached me as I was unloading a shipment of chicken feed. He was younger than I expected, with an expensive suit and an overly confident smile. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "I'm Mark Henderson. I think we can both agree this has gone on long enough. You're putting a lot of effort into this." He gestured vaguely at the store, as if it were a charming but foolish hobby. "Our offer is more than fair. It's a chance for you to have a comfortable retirement, without all this." He meant the sweat on my brow, the dust on my jeans. He meant the work. I looked him right in the eye. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice even, "my father built this business by helping his neighbors build theirs. He understood that a community is more valuable than a condominium complex. This isn't just a building, it's my home, and it's not for sale." His smile tightened. "The town council is very supportive of our revitalization project. It would be a shame if you found yourself facing unexpected obstacles. Inspections, permits, things can get complicated." It was a veiled threat, and we both knew it. "I'm sure they can," I said, turning my back on him and hefting another bag of feed. "I'll be ready." He stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked back to his car. The battle lines had been drawn. It was their vision of the future against my father's legacy. It was their money against our history, and I had no intention of backing down. The day of the soft opening arrived on a crisp Saturday in early October. We hadn't done much advertising, just a notice in the local paper, a few flyers Sarah had designed, and a post on our new Facebook page. I was a nervous wreck. I'd spent the last of my settlement money on initial inventory, bags of feed stacked neatly where the petrified ones had been, shelves stocked with gardening tools, chicken waterers, and Sarah's curated selection of organic seeds. The old cash register had been polished to a gleam, though I had a modern credit card reader tucked discreetly beside it. The place smelled of fresh paint, sawdust, and that faint sweet scent of grain that had never quite left. I stood behind the counter my father had stood behind for 40 years, my hands gripping the worn wood. What if no one came? What if Henderson was right, and this was all just a foolish, sentimental dream? What if I failed not only myself, but my father's memory? At 9 o'clock, I unlocked the door and flipped the open sign. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. The silence was deafening. Then, the little bell above the door, the same bell that had announced customers for half a century, jingled. Henry Gable stood there, his hat in his hands. He looked around the store, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "Looks just like it should, Frank's girl. Looks just right." He walked over to the counter and bought a 50-pound bag of cracked corn. He was my first customer. And then they started to come. At first, it was a trickle. Doris from the inn, George the carpenter, then more people, faces I recognized from my brief time back in town, and many I didn't. Sarah brought a carload of her fellow young farmers, who were thrilled by the selection of organic supplies. People didn't just come to shop. They came to talk, to share stories about my father, to welcome me home. They lingered, drinking the coffee I had brewed, turning the store into the community hub it had once been. Late in the afternoon, Mark Henderson's black SUV pulled up across the street. He sat there for a long time, watching the steady stream of people coming and going from the store. He saw the laughter, the community, the life that was buzzing inside this non-performing asset. He saw that he wasn't just fighting one 62-year-old woman, he was fighting a whole town. After about an hour, he started his car and drove away. I had a feeling I hadn't seen the last of him, but for the first time, I knew in my bones that we could win. As the last customer left, and I counted the modest earnings in the cash drawer, I felt a deep, quiet sense of peace. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. I hadn't magically become rich or solved all my problems. The developers were still a threat, the future was still uncertain, and running a business was going to be the hardest work of my life. But as I stood there, in the warm light of the store, surrounded by the legacy of my father's goodness, I knew I had found something far more valuable than the house I had lost. I had found my foundation. I had found my home. I looked up, as if I could see him, and whispered, "I'm doing the work, Dad. I'm finally doing the work." Starting over isn't about going back to the beginning. I know that now. It's not about erasing the past. It's about finding the foundation that was there all along, buried under the rubble of a life that wasn't truly yours. For me, it was a dusty old feed store. For you, it might be something else entirely. A forgotten skill, a rekindled friendship, a passion you set aside years ago. The most important inheritances aren't written in a will. They're the strength, resilience, and love that are passed down to us, waiting for the moment we need them most. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to dig deep and find your own foundation when the world tried to tell you you were finished, I'd be honored if you would leave a comment below. You don't have to share the details, but just letting us know that you're out there, fighting your own battles, makes this community stronger. Your story matters. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We're building a community here for people who understand that the most beautiful things can grow from the rockiest soil. Thank you for listening. You're not alone.